and welcome to StrandExplains, a podcast where we discuss what's happening in the world of precision medicine, from weird case studies and interesting facts to interviews with leaders in the industry.
Mental and addictive disorders affected more than 1 billion people globally, and that was 5 years ago. And last Sunday, depending on when this goes up, was Mental Health Day. And so we thought we'd talk about what mental health means to us, to Strand, to the world at large, and maybe, cover some more controversial therapies that involve mental health and precision medicine, such as fecal microbiota transplants or depression.
Yeah, mental health is not an easy one to talk about generally. I think because it's so personal for all of us.
Yeah,
It's difficult to discuss
it
not
is.
only about yourself but sometimes even about loved ones or people you care for. This is something I personally have had to deal with in my
Yeah.
life. So just so you know, I have anxiety and ADHD, so definitely have had my mental health struggles, and it's been a tough one. In terms
Yeah,
of
sorry to hear that, Sakshi. Yeah.
no, I mean, it's okay now. And I think I was diagnosed a few years ago, and it took me a while to realize what it meant to have anxiety and ADHD. One is just to realize I had anxiety and ADHD, and then to realize what that meant and how to deal with it. And I think one of the interesting things that really came out of it was it became easier for me to understand what it was and to talk to people about it the more I talked about it myself.
Right.
So, for instance, with the ADHD, a friend who has ADHD kind of said, Sakshi, maybe you should get checked out. There are some symptoms I've seen you present that I think could be of ADHD. I personally would have never gone. And that's not an easy conversation to have by any means, to like go up to someone you care about and be like, hey, I think you might have a mental health illness. But it, made such a
No,
big
no,
difference.
I second that. No, it's not easy to, tell someone or think, but it's the same as anything else, right? I mean, if someone walks with a limp, you tell them, hey, is that limp going? It's basic empathy, right? But somehow with
Exactly.
mental health, it becomes more sensitive. You second guess yourself. You tell other people, but not the person that actually needs to know about it in order to do something about it, right? And that's a
Exactly.
big part, right? I mean, having being able to have a sensitive conversation about it is a big part of you know good mental health, and having a sensitive conversation with someone you love or someone who's your friend.
100%. I totally agree. And I think adding on to that, one of the reasons I was excited to come and talk about mental health in general and kind of about my experiences as well is I realized mental health advocacy is nearly as important, maybe, as, getting your mental health checked out. So, on one hand, I had this thing happen with ADHD where a friend told me, but on the other hand, I have started talking about my anxiety. I've started talking to friends about the fact that I'm on medication at the moment for it. I've started becoming more open about it. And I've seen that my circle has become, of friends have become more open to the idea. Three or four of my friends are now in therapy. Two of three of them are considering getting on medication where they were really scared about it before. And so I think that aspect of it is also really important is when you create those safe spaces, other people feel open and more comfortable talking about things and more open to trying out things. And sometimes you just realize it's not as big a deal as it has to be. Like you said,
Yeah,
it's
it's not a
as
big
real
deal.
as, yeah, and it's as
Yeah,
real as physical pain. I have a headache.
yeah,
Oh, I'm going to go pop an Advil. It's
yeah,
in my
exactly.
head a very similar correlation, although
Yeah,
traditionally it's not always
exactly.
been seen that way.
It isn't, and it hasn't been not just. I mean, obviously, I think in India there is a stigma around. I think health in general, right? I
Uh-huh.
mean, but perhaps mental health in particular. Uh,
Definitely.
but that's not true just of India. But I wanted to ask you. I mean, it's true the Western world too. But I wanted to ask you: has being open about it, has it changed the anxiety itself that you have? Has it changed it for the better?
I think a little bit. At first, I was also really hesitant to talk about it. And so there was anxiety about the anxiety. Um,
Yes, that does
yeah,
compound, right? And you don't want to
exactly.
talk. I mean, what will other people think? How will they perceive you,
Exactly.
and so on? But that's not there. That meta anxiety, if
That
you will,
has,
is
yeah,
probably
that meta level has gone now. And it has become a lot easier for me to talk about it. I think one of them is just growing older, but also making it a practice to
Yeah,
be open to talk about it. Because that took a while, even like with my
yeah,
loved ones. It took a while, maybe not like my immediate family, but people who are further out to be like, I do struggle with my mental health sometimes and be okay to possibly face judgment from people who don't understand it, but also be
right.
okay with the idea that some people really don't care, and that's what makes it great, is when you can find those other people you can connect to and talk to about it.
Right, and you find empathy in the most unexpected places sometimes when you put when one puts themselves out there, they often find,
Definitely.
I never realized that, my aunt, right, that kind of thing, right? I
Yeah,
mean, you probably
exactly.
never reached out to someone before, but then it comes out and it's like they reach out back to you. It's like, oh my God, I can totally relate to what you're going through, right?
Exactly.
It's a human problem. So, I thought we'll talk a little bit about two emerging and unexpected fields of research in the mental health and precision medicine space. Right. So there's one on the gut microbiome. So there's a gut brain axis conversation that's been happening now for the past several years. And right. So there's several studies on that theme. And then there's another one on inflammation, which is basically saying that, well, there are people, obviously, if one has mental health issues, then one is, maybe has markers of inflammation. But then, some are saying that the causality might go the other way, where if one has these inflammation biomarkers, inflammation factors as biomarkers, then that may be prognostic of, disorders, like psychiatric disorders and so on. So those are the two things we'll talk about. Maybe we can start with the gut microbiome. What did you find about that, Sakshi?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, honestly, this is a really fascinating rabbit hole to go down. I've definitely heard about fecal microbiota
Yeah,
transplants before. It was also on a South Park episode. And while I've engaged with this material before in terms of I've seen studies that show that FMTs, because I'm going to mess up that word again, FMTs have been used for IBD. I've never seen them in the
yeah,
context of mental health. And so that was really
yeah,
fascinating. So maybe first I'll take a step back and explain the idea of the gut brain axis that RK just mentioned. So the gut
yeah.
brain axis is just biochemical and neural signaling between the GI tract and the brain. And it's the idea that there's communication happening between them, because obviously, digestion needs to
Right.
happen. And so the base theory here is that microbiota are actually able to modulate the gut brain axis. So the microbes that exist in your gut are interacting with the GBA, and because of that interaction, are able to actually affect your biochemical and neural signaling. And it's pretty
Fascinating.
interesting. Yeah. And so, what do you think about it, Arcade?
Yeah, no, I mean, what I've read is, I've been reading about this for so long now, right? The gut is everything,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and people are sort of waking up to the notion that we have these bacteria that we harbor from they're almost congenital in many ways. I mean, we are born with, a certain complement of bacteria that they do evolve over time, but there's also sort of an underlying sort of background that gives us some ability to combat our illnesses and mental or physical, right? And so there's, I mean, so the notion that of course you can control your mental state by simply, controlling the bacteria in your gut is new, right? And it's kind of a bit, I mean, still quite controversial, right? There was a 2020 review that discussed the possibility of using FMTs as a way of, treating various mental health disorders based on the
Yeah.
fact that, there are these individuals who have different gut microbiome compositions relative to people who are healthy, normal, or supposedly, right? But the problem is, I think it's, I think it's a very powerful tool, and people don't quite understand the sort of subsidiary effects of this tool, FMT, the fecal microbiome transplant. So right now there are only, preclinical and clinical studies done, right? And yeah, it's still kind of
Yeah.
very, very early days, so it's hard to sort of, say
Yeah.
something definitive about it, except that it exists.
No, agreed. And I think one thing I found interesting is within the 2020 review you mentioned, the final paragraph actually states that given the huge heterogeneity of psychiatric disorders, finding treatment that works for all patients is not achievable, especially given the range of factors that influence the disorder and treatment response. Basically, we can't. There's no one answer fits all or one solution fits all at this point, and you really have to get right down to the nitty gritties before
Yeah.
you can use something like this on a large
It's
scale.
crazy because, objective measures of mental health are also tough to. So, how do you define someone who's mentally healthy, right? It's easier maybe to define someone who's physically healthy. And that's the sort of second theme, which is, hey, are there like objective markers of mental health? And someone said, maybe inflammation, right? The
Ah,
immune system is knows all,
yeah.
right? And immunotherapy, there's just sorry, I mean, immunotherapy is one example, but the immune system is pretty current right now. I mean, it's the new deal, right? I mean, the last 10 years, the Nobel Prize in 2018 went to immunotherapy,
Yeah.
for example. And so this sort of builds on that theme, I think, to a large extent, of people just looking at the immune system as markers for nearly everything,
I see.
right? So they're saying basically, well, so it's not surprising perhaps so much that people who have, let's say, a certain mental health condition may have markers of inflammation that circulate in them.
Okay.
So the causality running from having the illness to having markers of the illness. But if some people hypothesize the opposite direction, which is that the markers are prognostic of illnesses that are sort of
Oh.
maybe latent in the person. So you may have circulating, immune markers. So basically, there are certain kinds of cells that if they're large in number, immune cells in your body, that if they're large in number, it's very very specific kinds of cells, which we don't have to mention the names today, but they're large in number. It means that perhaps you have, there's one for schizophrenia maybe, and there's one for, maybe there's one for ASD, autism spectrum disorder. Maybe there's another one for sleeping disorder, etc. Right. So this was a review in Nature,
Yeah.
and they saw these patterns of inflammatory changes in all of these related disorders. And so the idea is that there's a stress response, and the stress response releases these immune cells, and and then everything boils down to having these little things called cytokines, and these little cells. We talked about cytokine storm in a previous post on sepsis,
Yeah.
and it seems like that could be the culprit here as well. So,
Yeah.
so that's like a quick summary of what people are looking at as far as precision medicine. And as you said, right? I mean, if we're, it's not one size fits all,
Exactly.
and so you need to find these markers, and these markers are specific to the person,
Yeah.
or maybe a small group of people,
Yeah.
right? And so that's the quest here today, and we'll continue on.
So, no, exactly. I think one of the things that makes these things slightly harder is there have been studies that show that on population levels, there are differences, maybe not
Yeah.
major differences, but there are slight genetic differences in terms of mental health inflammatory markers and such. And so that, like you're saying, that one size fits all becomes a little more difficult to really prescribe as a specific response. I think one interesting thing that has also come out of all of this research is looking at inflammation as a potential therapeutic target. Currently, most of the targets that happen are small molecules, which are drugs that target the small molecules neurochemicals such as SSRIs, which target serotonin or melatonin receptors, or sometimes even melatonin for sleep disorders. But taking a step back to the causative area and looking at inflammatory markers could be a really cool way, kind of like nipping this in the bud. Obviously, keeping a holistic view of other potential impacts on the body.
Yeah. How are you feeling today about your anxiety?
I think I'm pretty good, actually. Thank you for asking. It's been an interesting journey, to say the least. I think I first realized I had anxiety 7 or 8 years ago. Weirdly enough, I only got on medication for it. I'm on an SSRI a year and a half ago.
Right.
maybe June 2020. And I'm actually in the process of getting off of it. I have a great psychiatrist and a great therapist who really helped me understand where my anxieties come from and help me deal with them and find ways and give me the tools to deal with them. And I'm feeling a lot better about it than I was even a year and a half ago. And the one kind of, maybe not PSA I'll give, but one thing I'd say is, get in touch with your mental health. It's a lot easier said than done. No one really wants to engage with their it's not no one wants to, but it's difficult sometimes to engage with your mental health, especially I feel like in an Indian context. And maybe I'm biased because that's what we've all grown up with. I found it can be difficult to talk about your mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. I think health in general is a place that we are only now developing the tools to talk about. I think it's a question of what tools we have. Um, Really, it's verbal, it's empathetic, it's being able to relate to someone else's what they're going through, right? And of course, it's also sort of being more well versed, right? So I was talking to someone about you know cancer the other day because they had cancer, they had thyroid cancer, and they understand the language not just of empathy but also of the particular condition. So I can say things like recurrence and metastasis and things like that, and they get it, right? So similarly, I think that kind of language needs to be developed, and that takes a while, right? People will keep but the thing is that since we have the internet, you're going to see WebMD, you're going to be savvy about the various mental health issues that, and everyone has their stories of aunts
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
extended family people or even parents or whatever, right? So hopefully things will improve. I think there's a case to be made for that. Yeah.
Definitely, I agree. And I mean, I hope conversations like this and just being open about it is, I think, just half of the battle, really.
Yes, absolutely. I think really we did have sort of an excuse for this podcast, which is to talk about precision medicine advances. But it's really, I would say that our conversation today is more about talking about mental health and being
Definitely.
open to talk about it.
Thanks so much for that conversation, RK. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoyed myself too, Sakshi, and hope you do feel better.
Thank you.